The supermarket security cameras captured everything, every word, every movement. And ICE agent Rafael Torres had absolutely no idea that the man he was about to handcuff had spent the last 20 years sitting on the federal bench, presiding over cases involving immigration enforcement abuse, civil rights violations, and Fourth Amendment overreach. The man standing next to the black Range Rover wasn't panicking. He wasn't begging. He wasn't even raising his voice. He was Judge Marcus Langston, and he had ruled against unlawful EXCE detention. He had written legal opinions on administrative warrant authority that became binding precedent. He had sent federal agents who violated constitutional rights into early retirement. And now he was about to become the plaintiff in a federal lawsuit that would cost the government $3.7 million and trigger a Department of Homeland Security investigation that would expose years of systemic racial profiling. Before we dive deeper into this outrageous story, I need your voice here. Drop a quick comment right now. Where are you watching from? Your city, country, or wherever you are? Let's show how widespread this fight really is. And if you believe no one should ever be abused, harassed, or detained just because they're black, if you believe government officials and law enforcement must be held accountable to every single person, no matter their skin color, smash that subscribe button right now. We're building a community that demands real justice and equality for all. This story is about to get even more explosive. You won't believe what comes next. Stick around. Marcus Langston was not someone who expected special treatment. At 54 years old, he had been a federal judge for exactly 2 decades, 20 years presiding over some of the most complex and controversial cases in the Northern District of Georgia. 20 years of immigration disputes, civil rights litigation, and yes, cases involving ICE misconduct and federal enforcement overreach. Judge Langston's courtroom was known for 2 things: fairness and precision. He held prosecutors to the highest standards. He held defense attorneys to the same. And he held federal agents, ICE, FBI, ATF, anyone wearing a badge, to the constitutional limits of their authority. He had ruled against warrantless immigration stops and workplace raids. He had written opinions on administrative warrant authority that were cited in 3 other federal circuits. He had presided over Bivens actions where immigrants sued federal agents for violating their Fourth Amendment rights. His colleagues respected him. Immigration attorneys feared going before him unprepared. And ICE's legal counsel knew that Judge Marcus Langston would not tolerate constitutional shortcuts in his courtroom, no matter how noble the enforcement objective claimed to be. He had been born and raised in Atlanta, grew up in the historic West End neighborhood, attended Morehouse College, then Yale Law School, clerked for a Sixth Circuit judge, worked at a prestigious civil rights firm for 8 years, then was nominated to the federal bench at 34 years old. Confirmed unanimously by the Senate, a lifelong U.S. citizen with an impeccable record and a reputation for being brilliant, fair, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to constitutional rights. That Saturday afternoon in late September, Judge Langston was doing something completely ordinary. Something millions of Americans do every single weekend without incident. He was grocery shopping. He had driven to a Whole Foods in Buckhead, one of Atlanta's most affluent neighborhoods. It was 2:47 in the afternoon. The parking lot was busy but not crowded. Families loading SUVs with organic produce and weekend supplies. Couples carrying reusable bags. Nothing unusual, nothing tense. Judge Langston had parked his black Range Rover in a spot near the store entrance. He'd gone inside, picked up groceries for the week. Fresh vegetables, some salmon, a few bottles of wine, the usual staples. Why, he'd paid with his credit card, exchanged pleasantries with the cashier, and walked back out into the warm Georgia sunshine. He was wearing jeans, a casual button-down shirt, and comfortable loafers. Weekend clothes. Nothing flashy, nothing that drew attention. He looked like exactly what he was, a professional in his 50s running weekend errands. He opened the rear hatch of his Range Rover and began loading the grocery bags. Methodical, unhurried. He placed the heavier items in first, then the lighter bags on top. He was thinking about the week ahead. He had oral arguments scheduled for Tuesday morning in a complex asylum case. He needed to finish reviewing the briefs Sunday evening. The parking lot around him hummed with normal weekend activity. A woman 2 cars over was buckling her toddler into a car seat. An elderly couple was slowly making their way toward the store entrance. A teenager was loading cases of bottled water into a pickup truck. Judge Langston had no idea that his life was about to change. He had no idea that in approximately 90 seconds he would be detained by a federal agent. He had no idea that he was being watched. He placed the last grocery bag into his vehicle and closed the hatch. He pulled his key fob from his pocket. And that's when he heard the voice behind him. Authoritative, aggressive, already escalating. "Sir, I need you to step away from the vehicle and show me identification." Marcus turned around slowly. A man in tactical gear was approaching him rapidly, hand resting on his service weapon. The man's jacket had 3 letters printed across the chest in bold white font. ICE. Marcus Langston kept his hands visible. 20 years on the federal bench had taught him exactly what this was. He recognized an unlawful detention the moment it began. ICE agent Rafael Torres was 32 years old, 6 years with the agency, and he was approaching Marcus with the kind of aggressive posture that suggested he expected resistance. His right hand hovered near his holstered weapon. Not drawn, but ready. A position of tactical readiness that immediately transformed a parking lot conversation into something far more serious. "Sir, I need to see identification and proof of legal status," Torres said. His tone wasn't requesting, it was demanding. Marcus took a slow breath. He could feel his legal mind shifting into a different mode. Not panic, not fear, analysis. "Officer, I'm a U.S. citizen loading groceries into my own vehicle. What reasonable suspicion do you have that I'm violating immigration law?" Torres didn't like the question. Most people he stopped didn't ask questions. They just complied, nervous and intimidated by the federal authority he represented. "I'm responding to a report. I need to see your papers, now." "What report?" Marcus asked calmly. "What specific suspicious activity was reported?" "A suspicious person call came in about a black male acting suspiciously near vehicles in this parking lot." Torres gestured vaguely at the surrounding area. "You match the description." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. A black male. Near vehicles. That was the entire description. No actual crime, no immigration violation, no specific behavior beyond existing while black in an upscale parking lot. "What specifically was reported as suspicious?" Marcus pressed. "Was there a report of theft? Vehicle tampering? What crime am I suspected of committing?" Torres's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'm conducting an immigration enforcement investigation. Under federal authority, I have the right to question individuals about their legal status." "No, actually, you don't," Marcus said quietly. "Not without reasonable suspicion of an immigration violation. Arizona versus United States established clear limits on when you can demand immigration status. Simply existing in a parking lot isn't reasonable suspicion." The woman loading groceries 2 cars away had stopped what she was doing. She was watching now, her phone held loosely in her hand. Torres took a step closer. "Are you refusing to cooperate with a federal immigration investigation?" "I'm asking you to articulate the legal basis for this stop," Marcus replied, keeping his voice level and controlled. "That's not refusal. That's my constitutional right as a U.S. citizen." "Then show me proof you're a U.S. citizen." "Show me your reasonable suspicion first." Torres' hand tightened on his weapon belt. "Sir, under ICE authority, I can detain individuals for administrative questioning about immigration status in public spaces. I don't need your permission." "That's not accurate," Marcus said. He could cite the cases from memory. He'd ruled on several of them. "You need reasonable suspicion that I've violated immigration law. You haven't articulated any. A vague call about a black man near cars isn't reasonable suspicion. It's racial profiling." The teenager loading water bottles into his truck had stopped. He was staring now. So was the elderly couple who had been walking toward the store. They'd frozen mid-step, sensing the tension crackling through the air. Torres' face was flushing. I'm going to ask you one more time. Show me identification and proof of legal status. Marcus made a decision. He had two choices. He could continue asserting his rights and risk escalation, or he could comply under protest and handle this through proper legal channels afterward. But he also knew something Torres didn't seem to grasp. This wasn't just about Marcus Langston, private citizen. This was about what happened when federal agents believed they could demand papers from anyone who looked foreign to them. Officer, I'm going to comply with your request, Marcus said clearly. But I want to state for the record that this stop lacks any reasonable suspicion of criminal activity or immigration violation. This is an unlawful seizure under the Fourth Amendment. I'm reaching into my pocket now to retrieve my wallet. He moved slowly, deliberately. His hand stayed visible. He pulled out his leather wallet and extracted his driver's license. Torres snatched it from his hand and studied it. Marcus Langston, Atlanta address. The registration visible through his Range Rover's windshield matched the name and address perfectly. This your vehicle? Torres demanded. Yes. Prove it. Marcus held up his key fob and pressed the lock button. The Range Rover's lights flashed. The locks clicked. He pressed unlock. The lights flashed again. Torres should have apologized and left. Any reasonable agent would have recognized the stop was baseless. The man had identification. He owned the vehicle he was loading. There was no crime, no violation, no legitimate basis for continued detention. But Torres had a problem. He had made this stop in front of witnesses. He had escalated it based on nothing more than racial assumptions. And backing down now in front of the growing audience of shoppers who had stopped to watch would look like weakness. The woman with her phone was recording now. Marcus could see her thumb moving across the screen. She was filming everything. Torres walked back to his vehicle with Marcus's license, his tactical boots heavy on the asphalt. Marcus stood next to his Range Rover, hands visible, waiting, and the warm afternoon sun felt surreal against the cold reality of what was happening. This was a federal agent demanding papers from a U.S. citizen in a grocery store parking lot. And Marcus Langston knew exactly how many constitutional violations were already stacking up. Torres sat in his vehicle for 7 minutes. Marcus could see him through the windshield, running the license through federal databases, talking on his radio. 7 minutes was far too long for a simple ID check. This wasn't verification anymore, this was phishing. When Torres finally emerged and walked back, his expression hadn't softened. If anything, he looked more determined. He handed Marcus his license back without a word. Everything check out? Marcus asked calmly. You're clean, Torres admitted. No warrants, no criminal history. Marcus waited. This was the moment Torres should apologize for the inconvenience and leave. Any competent agent would recognize that detaining someone for loading groceries into their own registered vehicle was indefensible. Torres didn't leave. I'm going to need to search your vehicle, he said instead. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. On what basis? I have reasonable suspicion that there may be contraband or undocumented passengers in the vehicle. Based on what specific articulable facts? Torres gestured vaguely at the Range Rover. High-value vehicle. Nervousness during the stop. Evasive answers to questions. I wasn't nervous, Marcus said evenly. I was asserting my constitutional rights, and I didn't evade anything. I provided identification, demonstrated ownership, and complied with your requests. None of that creates reasonable suspicion for a search. ICE has administrative warrant authority to conduct searches in public spaces during immigration enforcement operations, Torres said. He sounded like he was reciting from a training manual he'd half memorized. Marcus shook his head slowly. No, you don't. Administrative warrants are for specific workplace enforcement actions, and even those require judicial authorization. You don't have blanket authority to search vehicles in public parking lots. Arizona versus United States, 567 U.S. 387. The Supreme Court specifically limited state and local police from enforcing immigration law, and federal immigration officers still need reasonable suspicion of an immigration violation to justify detention or search. Torres's face flushed darker. Now, are you a lawyer? I'm a federal judge. The parking lot seemed to go very quiet. Even the ambient noise of cars and shoppers seemed to fade. The woman who had been recording lifted her phone higher, making sure she captured everything. Torres stared at Marcus. You're a what? A federal judge. United States District Court, Northern District of Georgia. I've been on the bench for 20 years, and you've just violated my Fourth Amendment rights in a manner so clearly established that you won't be able to claim qualified immunity. Torres's hand moved away from his weapon. His posture shifted. For the first time since the encounter began, uncertainty crossed his face. I need to see proof of that. Marcus reached back into his wallet and pulled out his federal credentials. The official United States Court's identification with his photograph, his name, his title, and the seal of the federal judiciary. He handed it to Torres. Torres studied the credentials, turning the card over in his hands. His fingers were trembling slightly. This could be fake. Call the federal courthouse. The main number is public information. Ask for the clerk's office. They'll confirm my identity. The woman recording called out from her position 20 feet away. I've got all of this on video, everything. Torres looked at her, then back at Marcus. Sir, you need to step away from the vehicle. We're well past that point, Agent, Marcus said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now. You've detained me unlawfully. You've continued the detention past any reasonable time frame. You've requested a search without probable cause. And now you're escalating because you've realized you made a mistake. What you should do right now is return my credentials, apologize, and call your supervisor. I don't have to do anything, Torres shot back, but his voice had lost its authority. Actually, you do, because I'm not just going to file a complaint. I'm going to file a federal lawsuit under Bivens, and every decision you make in the next 60 seconds is going to be evidence in that lawsuit. The cameras are recording. You have federal credentials in your hand. You know who I am. You know this stop was baseless, and you're choosing to continue it anyway. Torres made his worst decision of the afternoon. Instead of de-escalating, instead of calling a supervisor, and instead of admitting the mistake and trying to minimize the damage, he decided to assert his authority one more time. Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for obstruction of a federal immigration enforcement operation. Marcus didn't move. There is no operation. There's an agent who saw a black man in an expensive car and made assumptions. But if you're going to arrest me, do it. The video is recording. My credentials are in your hand, and you're about to make a mistake that will end your career. Marcus turned around slowly. He placed his hands behind his back. The metal handcuffs were cold against his wrists, clicking into place with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the parking lot. You're making the biggest mistake of your career, Marcus said quietly as Torres tightened the cuffs. But I want to be clear about what's happening here. I am Judge Marcus Langston, United States District Court, Northern District of Georgia. I am a lifelong U.S. citizen. I was loading groceries into my own vehicle when you detained me without reasonable suspicion. You have my federal credentials in your possession. You know who I am, and you're arresting me anyway. Torres guided him toward the ICE vehicle, one hand on Marcus's elbow. You can tell it to the supervisor at the field office. I'll tell it to a federal jury, Marcus replied. The crowd of onlookers had grown. At least a dozen people had stopped what they were doing to watch. 3 people were recording now, phones held high. The woman who had started filming first was narrating into her phone. They're arresting him. The ICE agent is arresting a federal judge for loading groceries. I'm getting all of this. An older man in the crowd called out, What's he being arrested for? Torres ignored him, opening the rear door of his vehicle. The back seat was separated from the front by a metal mesh partition. It smelled like sweat and fear and the chemical cleaner they used between transports. Marcus had never been in the back of a law enforcement vehicle before, not in his entire life. He sat down carefully, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The position was immediately uncomfortable. The plastic seat was hard and molded. There was no way to sit that didn't put pressure on his shoulders. Torres closed the door and got in the front seat. He sat there for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, not moving. Marcus could see his reflection in the rearview mirror. Torres looked like a man who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd just done, but who was too committed to the course of action to turn back now. "You can still fix this," Marcus said from the back seat. "Call your supervisor. Tell them what happened. Release me with an apology. It'll still be bad for you, but it won't be catastrophic." Torres started the engine without responding. The drive to the ice field office took 18 minutes. Torres didn't say a single word the entire time. Marcus sat in silence, his mind already working through the legal strategy. What claims to file? What evidence to preserve? What witnesses to contact? What precedents to cite? He had spent 20 years on the other side of cases like this. Right? He had read complaints from immigrants who claimed they were racially profiled. He had reviewed body camera footage of stops that lacked reasonable suspicion. He had ruled on motions to suppress evidence obtained from unlawful searches. Now he was living it. Now he understood viscerally what it felt like to have your citizenship questioned, your rights dismissed, your dignity stripped away based on nothing more than the color of your skin, and someone's assumptions about who belongs in an expensive car. The ice field office was a low-slung concrete building in an industrial area near the airport. Torres pulled into a secured parking area behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. He got out, opened Marcus's door, and helped him out of the vehicle with a hand under his elbow. Now they walked through a secure entrance into a processing area. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The walls were institutional beige. Everything smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. A female immigration officer looked up from her desk as they entered. Her nameplate read Maria Ochoa. She was in her early 40s with the tired eyes of someone who had processed thousands of detainees and heard every possible story. "What have we got?" she asked Torres, pulling out an intake form. "Obstruction of a federal immigration enforcement operation. Detained in the Buckhead Whole Foods parking lot." Ochoa started filling out the form. "Name?" "Marcus Langston." She wrote it down. "Date of birth?" Marcus provided it. She continued with the standard questions. Address, emergency contact. Then she reached for his personal belongings. "Now I need to inventory your property." Torres handed her the wallet he'd taken from Marcus's pocket during the arrest. Ochoa opened it and began cataloging the contents. Driver's license, credit cards, $63 in cash, a family photo. And then she stopped. Her hand froze. She pulled out the federal court credentials slowly, studying them in the harsh fluorescent light. She looked at the ID card. She looked at Marcus. She looked at Torres. "Where did you arrest him?" Her voice had changed completely. "Whole Foods parking lot. Suspicious person call." "What was he doing?" "Loading groceries into a Range Rover." Ochoa set down the credentials very carefully on her desk. She stood up. "Wait here." She walked directly to a closed office door at the far end of the room, knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. Through the door's window, Marcus could see her talking urgently to a man in a white shirt and tie. The man's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, horror. The man stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. He grabbed the credentials from Ochoa's hand, studied them for maybe 3 seconds, and then looked through his office window directly at Marcus standing in handcuffs in the processing area. Field Office Director Thomas Brennan had been with ICE for 28 years. He had managed difficult situations. He had dealt with controversial arrests. He had navigated political firestorms. But he had never in his entire career had an agent bring in a sitting federal judge. Brennan came out of his office like a man walking toward a fire he needed to put out immediately. Not he moved fast. his tie slightly askew, the federal credentials still clutched in his hand. Ochoa followed 2 steps behind, her face carefully neutral but her eyes sharp. "Get those cuffs off him," Brennan said to Torres before he'd even reached the processing area. "Now!" Torres fumbled with his keys. His hands were shaking as he unlocked the handcuffs. The metal released with a click, and Marcus brought his arms forward slowly, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had pressed into his skin. Brennan stopped 3 feet away from Marcus, close enough for a conversation but maintaining a professional distance. He looked at the credentials one more time, as if hoping they might have changed in the last 30 seconds, then looked at Marcus's face. "Judge Langston," Brennan said. His voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a man trying very hard not to panic in front of his staff. "I'm Thomas Brennan, Field Office Director. On behalf of ICE, I apologize for this situation. You're being released immediately." "What am I being charged with?" Marcus asked. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath. "That's being reviewed. I want everything in writing, the initial call report, the body camera footage, the dash cam footage from Agent Torres's vehicle, the intake report, Agent Torres's written statement of probable cause for the arrest, every communication between this office and anyone else regarding my detention. Everything." Brennan nodded quickly. "I will have those ready for you." "How long will that take?" "We can have digital copies ready within 24 hours. "I want them tonight." There was no room for negotiation in Marcus's tone. Brennan had spent enough time in federal court to recognize it. The voice of a judge who had made a ruling and expected compliance. "I'll make sure you have them tonight, sir. We'll email them to whatever address you provide. And I want Agent Torres's complete service record. Every stop he's made in the last 5 years. Demographics of the individuals stopped. Search rates by ethnicity. Arrest rates. Complaint history. All of it." Brennan's face tightened. That kind of request meant only one thing. Lawsuit. Pattern and practice evidence. Discovery that would expose problems far beyond this single incident. "That will require a formal discovery request through litigation," Brennan said carefully. "Then expect the litigation," Marcus replied, "because I'm filing a federal complaint. Bivens action for constitutional violations. Fourth Amendment unlawful seizure. Fifth Amendment due process violation. Equal Protection Clause violation for racial profiling. False arrest, false imprisonment. And I'm naming Agent Torres individually and the United States government as defendants." Ochoa was collecting Marcus's belongings from the intake desk, placing everything back into his wallet with careful precision. His driver's license, his credit cards, the cash, the federal credentials. She handed the wallet to him without making eye contact, but Marcus caught the slightest nod from her. A gesture of respect. Or maybe solidarity. Torres stood off to the side, his face pale, his hands at his sides. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the institutional beige walls. "Is there anything else we can do for you right now?" Brennan asked, his tone still carefully professional but with an undertone of desperation. "I need my vehicle," Marcus said. "It's still in the Whole Foods parking lot. I need a ride back to it, or I'm calling an attorney to meet me here, and we'll start this process right now." "I'll drive you myself," Brennan said quickly, "or I can have another agent—" "Not Agent Torres." "Of course not. Officer Ochoa, can you drive Judge Langston back to his vehicle?" Ochoa nodded. "Yes, sir." Marcus looked at Torres for the first time since they'd arrived at the field office. The younger man couldn't meet his eyes. "Agent Torres," Marcus said quietly, "you should know something. I've presided over 43 cases involving ICE enforcement actions in my 20 years on the bench. I've ruled on Fourth Amendment challenges to immigration stops. I've written opinions on administrative warrant authority. I've sent federal agents into early retirement for violating constitutional rights." Torres finally looked up. His face was ashen. "And now I'm going to be on the other side of one of those cases," Marcus continued. "Every legal brief I've read, every motion I've denied, every argument I've rejected about qualified immunity and good faith exceptions. I'm going to use all of that knowledge because you didn't just arrest a citizen today. You arrested someone who knows exactly how to hold you accountable. The silence in the processing area was absolute. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed quieter. Brennan cleared his throat. Officer Ochoa, please take Judge Langston back to his vehicle. Ochoa grabbed her keys from the desk. This way, sir. Marcus walked out of the ice field office with his head high, his dignity intact, and his mind already building the case that would cost the federal government $3.7 million. Officer Ochoa's unmarked vehicle was a standard government-issue sedan, far more comfortable than the back of Torres's transport. She drove in silence for the first few minutes, navigating through late-afternoon Atlanta traffic with practiced efficiency. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, watching the city pass by through the window. For what it's worth, Ochoa finally said, her eyes still on the road. I'm sorry that happened to you. Marcus turned to look at her. How long have you been with ICE? 12 years. You've seen this before. It wasn't a question. Ochoa's jaw tightened slightly. I've processed a lot of people who shouldn't have been brought in. People stopped for nothing. Citizens, legal residents. People who just looked wrong to whoever stopped them. She paused. But I've never seen anyone arrested who could fight back the way you can. Most people can't, Marcus said quietly. I know. They drove in silence for another moment. Then Ochoa said, Torres is going to be terminated. You know that, right? Good. Brennan's probably on the phone with DHS headquarters right now. This is going to go all the way up the chain. Also good. Ochoa glanced at him briefly before returning her eyes to the road. Are you really going to sue? Absolutely. It's going to get ugly. They'll fight it. They'll try to claim you were uncooperative, that Torres had reasonable suspicion, that it was all a misunderstanding. Let them try, Marcus said. I have 20 years of experience evaluating those exact arguments. I know every defense they'll raise and every reason those defenses will fail. And unlike most people they do this to, I have the resources and the knowledge to see it through to the end. They pulled into the Whole Foods parking lot 22 minutes after leaving the field office. Marcus's Range Rover was exactly where he'd left it, the rear hatch still slightly ajar from when Torres had interrupted him. Yep, the grocery bags were still visible inside, though someone had pushed them further into the cargo area, probably to close the hatch partially. Ochoa pulled up next to the Range Rover and put the sedan in park. She turned to face Marcus directly. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. When you file your lawsuit, when you expose what Torres did, when the data comes out about his stop patterns. She hesitated. Will it help? Will it actually change anything? Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I don't know, he finally admitted. I'd like to think it will. I'd like to think that when someone with my credentials, my position, my resources gets treated this way, it'll force people to acknowledge that this is happening to everyone. That if they'll do it to a federal judge, they're absolutely doing it to immigrants and citizens who can't fight back. But you're not sure. I'm sure of what I can control. I can file the lawsuit. I can expose the pattern. I can force reforms in this field office. I can cost them enough money that they have to take it seriously. He opened the car door. Whether that translates into real change beyond this one office, beyond this one agent, that's bigger than any single case. Ochoa nodded slowly. Well, for what it's worth, I hope you win, and I hope they pay you a lot of money. I'm donating whatever I get to immigrant rights organizations, Marcus said. I don't need the money, but thousands of people need protection from agents like Torres. He stepped out of the vehicle and walked to his Range Rover. His key fob was still in his pocket. He pressed the button, and the hatch opened fully with a soft, electronic hum. The groceries had shifted during the detention, bags tilted at odd angles. He straightened them mechanically, making sure nothing had spilled. Ochoa lowered her window. Judge Langston? He turned back to look at her. Thank you, she said, for fighting this. A lot of us who work inside the system, we see the problems, but we can't. She stopped, searching for the right words. We can't fix it from the inside. Maybe you can force them to from the outside. Marcus nodded. I'm going to try. Ochoa drove away, leaving Marcus alone in the parking lot where his ordinary Saturday afternoon had been shattered 90 minutes earlier. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the asphalt. The parking lot had mostly cleared out. On the weekend, shoppers had gone home to their families, their groceries, their normal lives. Marcus closed his hatch, got in his Range Rover, and sat behind the wheel for a long moment. His wrists still ached where the handcuffs had been. His shoulders were sore from sitting with his hands restrained behind his back. But more than the physical discomfort, he felt a deep, cold anger settling in his chest. He had spent 20 years protecting constitutional rights from the bench. Now he was going to protect them from the plaintiff's table. He started the engine and drove home. He had calls to make, lawyers to contact, evidence to preserve, a lawsuit to prepare. Stories like this remind us that real change often starts when someone with power experiences what so many face every day. If you believe in holding systems accountable and want more stories that expose injustice and celebrate when justice wins, hit that subscribe button right now. We're building a space that demands better, and your support keeps these stories coming. By Monday morning, every senior official at ICE headquarters would know the name Marcus Langston. And they would know they had a serious problem. Marcus arrived home at 6:43 in the evening. His house was a modest craftsman in Virginia Highland, a historic Atlanta neighborhood with tree-lined streets and front porches. He had lived there for 15 years. It was quiet, comfortable, unremarkable. The kind of place where a federal judge could have a private life away from the courtroom. He carried his groceries inside, put the perishables in the refrigerator, and left everything else on the kitchen counter. Then he sat down at his desk in the study and started making phone calls. The first call went to Chief Judge Patricia Morrison of the Northern District of Georgia. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm and familiar. They had worked together for 12 years. Marcus, how was your weekend? I need to tell you something, and you're not going to believe it. The warmth left her voice immediately. What happened? I was arrested this afternoon by ICE in the Whole Foods parking lot for loading groceries into my car. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then very carefully, tell me everything. Marcus walked her through the entire incident. The stop, the demands for papers, the assertion of his rights, the revelation of his credentials, the arrest anyway, the processing at the Icefield office, the panicked release. When he finished, Judge Morrison said, "This is going to be a problem." For them, yes. Marcus, you understand the position this puts the court in? You're going to be a plaintiff in a federal civil rights case. Against a federal agency. I know. And I'm going to recuse myself from any ICE-related cases going forward. I'll file the necessary paperwork Monday morning. But, Patricia, this has to be addressed. What happened to me happens to people every day. The only difference is I have the knowledge and resources to fight back. What do you need from me? Nothing official, just wanted you to hear it from me before it hits the news. His second call went to David Chen, one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the Southeast. And they had known each other since law school. Chen had argued cases in Marcus's courtroom. They respected each other immensely. Marcus, good to hear from you. What's going on? David, I need to hire you as my attorney. There was a pause. For what? Marcus told the story again. By the end, Chen was laughing, but it was the kind of laughter that came from disbelief rather than humor. They arrested you, a sitting federal judge, for loading groceries. Yes. And you have it on video. Multiple videos. Bystander recording, body camera, supermarket surveillance. Marcus, this is the most slam dunk civil rights case I've seen in 20 years. When do you want to file? Wednesday, I want a comprehensive complaint. Bivens' action against Torres individually. Section 1983 equivalent claims against the government. Fourth Amendment, unlawful seizure. Fifth Amendment, due process. Equal protection for racial profiling. False arrest, false imprisonment, everything. I'll start drafting tonight. We'll make it airtight. The third call went to the ACLU, the fourth to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the fifth to an immigrant rights organization called the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights. By 10 p.m., Marcus had spoken to 8 different organizations, all of whom wanted to support the case in various ways. Amicus briefs, public statements, media coordination. Monday morning, the conversations were happening at levels Marcus wasn't even directly involved in. The chief judge had briefed the other judges in the Northern District. The Administrative Office of the United States Courts had been notified. Judicial Conference leadership was aware how the story was spreading through the federal judiciary like wildfire. By Monday afternoon, it had reached the Department of Homeland Security headquarters in Washington. An emergency meeting was convened with ICE leadership, DHS legal counsel, and representatives from the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. Wednesday morning at 9:47 a.m., David Chen filed a 31-page federal complaint in the Northern District of Georgia. The caption read, Marcus Langston versus Rafael Torres and United States of America. The complaint was a masterpiece of legal drafting. It laid out every constitutional violation in meticulous detail. It cited Supreme Court precedent. It included timestamps from the video footage. It quoted Torres's own statements. It was devastating. And count 1. Bivens' claim against Rafael Torres for Fourth Amendment violation. Unlawful seizure without reasonable suspicion. Count 2. Bivens' claim against Rafael Torres for Fifth Amendment violation. Deprivation of liberty without due process. Count 3. Bivens' claim against Rafael Torres for equal protection violation. Detention based on racial profiling. Count 4. False arrest and false imprisonment against Torres and the United States. Count 5. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. The complaint demanded compensatory damages, punitive damages against Torres individually, declaratory relief, injunctive relief requiring policy changes, and attorney's fees. By Thursday morning, the story had leaked to the media. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution broke it first with a headline that would be repeated across the country. Federal judge arrested by ICE while loading groceries, files $5 million lawsuit. By Thursday afternoon, it had gone national. CNN picked it up, MSNBC, Fox News, NPR, The New York Times, The Washington Post. Every major outlet was covering it, and then the video dropped. The woman who had recorded the encounter in the Whole Foods parking lot posted it to Twitter with a simple caption. ICE agent arrests federal judge for shopping while black. I filmed everything. Within 6 hours, it had 2 million views. Within 12 hours, 5 million. By Friday morning, 8 million people had watched a federal judge calmly asserting his constitutional rights while being handcuffed for loading groceries. The comment sections exploded. Thousands of people shared their own stories of ICE encounters, of being stopped and questioned about their citizenship despite being born in America, of having their papers demanded in workplaces, in schools, in hospitals, of being detained for hours because they looked foreign. Immigration advocacy organizations shared the video across every platform. This is what enforcement looks like, they wrote. If they'll do this to a federal judge, imagine what they do to people without power. Legal experts appeared on cable news breaking down every violation Torres had committed. Law professors wrote op-eds. Former ICE officials gave interviews distancing themselves from Torres's actions. The current ICE officials released carefully worded statements about how this incident does not reflect our values, and we take these allegations seriously. The supermarket surveillance footage was released through a FOIA request by the ACLU. It showed everything from a wider angle. Marcus loading groceries, Torres approaching aggressively, the entire confrontation, the arrest, multiple camera angles, crystal clear footage. By the end of the first week, the story had been viewed over 15 million times across all platforms. It had become a cultural moment, a symbol of everything wrong with immigration enforcement, a vivid illustration of how racial profiling worked in practice. And in a federal courthouse in Atlanta, David Chen was preparing discovery requests that would expose just how deep the problems went. And David Chen's discovery requests landed like grenades in the offices of ICE's Office of Chief Counsel. 53 pages of meticulously crafted demands for every document, every communication, every data point related to Rafael Torres's 4 years of immigration enforcement work. Stop reports, body camera footage, complaint history, demographic breakdowns of every person he detained, search rates by race and ethnicity, arrest rates, outcomes. The kind of discovery that doesn't just defend against one bad arrest. The kind that exposes systemic problems an agency would prefer to keep buried. But before Chen's requests could even be fully processed, 2 separate investigations had already begun. Now, the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General opened a formal investigation within 72 hours of the lawsuit being filed. They had no choice. A sitting federal judge arrested for loading groceries wasn't a PR problem that could be managed with careful statements and policy reminders. It was a constitutional crisis that demanded immediate, independent scrutiny. ICE's own Office of Professional Responsibility launched a parallel internal review the same week. The 2 investigations would ultimately share evidence, interview transcripts, and findings, working in a rare coordination born from the recognition that this case could reshape immigration enforcement policy across the entire country. The investigations took 6 weeks. Investigators interviewed Rafael Torres 3 separate times, each session growing more confrontational as the evidence mounted. They reviewed the supermarket surveillance footage frame by frame. They analyzed the body camera footage Torres had been required to activate during the encounter. They pulled the original tip that had supposedly justified the stop, a vague call about a black male acting suspiciously near vehicles, with no specific criminal activity described. No vehicle description, no clothing description beyond race. They interviewed Maria Ochoa, who described Torres's demeanor when he brought Judge Langston into processing. They interviewed Field Office Director Brennan, who provided a timeline of the panicked calls up the chain of command. They interviewed the bystanders who had witnessed and recorded the arrest. And then they did something that turned the investigation from bad to catastrophic for Torres. They pulled his complete enforcement history. Every stop he'd made in 4 years, every detention, every search, every arrest. 4 years of data that painted a picture Torres had hoped would never be examined this closely. The numbers were damning. Over his 4-year tenure with ICE, Rafael Torres had stopped or detained individuals at a rate that showed stark racial disparities. Black and Latino individuals were stopped at 4.2 times the rate of white individuals in the same enforcement area. His suspicious person stops, the category under which he detained Judge Langston, were 89% people of color. White individuals accounted for just 11% of these supposedly neutral, behavior-based stops. And the outcomes revealed the stops were fishing expeditions, not legitimate enforcement. Only 11% of Torres's suspicious person stops resulted in actual immigration violations. The vast majority, 89%, ended with no charges, no immigration action, just inconvenient citizens and legal residents who happened to look foreign to Agent Torres. The investigators found 7 previous complaints against Torres spanning 3 years. Complaints from citizens who said they'd been stopped without cause. Complaints alleging racial profiling. Complaints describing aggressive interrogations in parking lots, outside apartment buildings, near schools. Every single complaint had been reviewed internally and dismissed as unsubstantiated or resolved with additional training. No one had ever looked at the pattern. And no one had pulled the data to see if the individual complaints formed a larger picture. Or perhaps more accurately, no one had wanted to look. The final investigative report was 124 pages long. Its findings were clinical, precise, and devastating. Torres had no legitimate basis for stopping Judge Langston. The vague tip provided no articulable suspicion of immigration violation. Torres's own statements during the encounter demonstrated racial profiling. He had assumed undocumented status based on appearance alone. He had exceeded his administrative warrant authority by demanding a vehicle search without probable cause. He had violated ICE's own guidelines on public enforcement actions, which required reasonable suspicion of immigration violations before initiating contact. And the stop wasn't an isolated mistake. It was part of a pattern of racially discriminatory enforcement that had been ignored, excused, and enabled for years. 8 weeks after the arrest, Rafael Torres was terminated from ICE. The termination letter cited willful violation of constitutional rights, exceeding legal authority, racial profiling, and conduct unbecoming a federal officer. He was banned from future federal law enforcement employment. His personnel file would be flagged permanently. Torres's union reviewed the evidence and gave him advice that was remarkable for its bluntness. Walk away. Don't appeal. Don't fight the termination. The video evidence alone was indefensible, and the pattern data made any defense impossible. Fighting would only extend the public attention and potentially expose him to personal liability beyond what was already coming in the lawsuit. Now, Rafael Torres never worked in law enforcement again. He moved out of Georgia 3 months later, took a job in private security that lasted less than a year, and eventually left that industry entirely. He gave one interview to a local news station in his new city, claiming he had followed his training and that the outcome was politically motivated. The interviewer asked him what specific suspicious behavior Judge Langston had exhibited that justified the stop. Torres couldn't articulate a single fact beyond a black man near expensive cars. The interview was never broadcast in full, but clips circulated online, serving only to reinforce what the investigations had already proven. The pattern was clear. The accountability was real. And the question everyone was asking was whether this was one bad agent finally caught, or a symptom of something much larger. The Inspector General's report on Rafael Torres was damning, but it raised an uncomfortable question that the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division couldn't ignore. If one agent had operated with such obvious racial bias for 4 years without meaningful oversight, what did that say about the entire field office? The Civil Rights Division opened a broader investigation 3 months after Torres's termination. This wasn't about one bad agent anymore. This was a pattern and practice investigation examining whether the Atlanta IC field office had engaged in systemic constitutional violations. The kind of investigation that could result in a consent decree, federal monitoring, and mandated reforms that would reshape how immigration enforcement operated across an entire region. The investigation took 11 months. Federal attorneys and civil rights investigators pulled 6 years of enforcement data from the Atlanta field office. They reviewed thousands of stop reports, detention records, and complaint files. They interviewed current and former ICE agents, detainees, immigrant advocacy organizations, and civil rights attorneys who had handled cases involving Atlanta ICE enforcement. The final report was 124 pages of carefully documented constitutional violations that had been treated as routine enforcement. Warrantless public stops that targeted individuals based on race and appearance, rather than actual suspicion of immigration violations. Administrative warrant authority that agents fundamentally misunderstood, using it to justify searches and detentions that exceeded their legal authority. Training programs that focused on enforcement tactics but provided inadequate instruction on Fourth Amendment limits and constitutional protections. Most troubling was the complete absence of meaningful oversight. No supervisors reviewed stop patterns to identify racial disparities. No early warning systems flagged agents whose stops rarely resulted in legitimate immigration violations. No mechanisms existed to track complaints about racial profiling or constitutional violations across multiple incidents. And when individuals asserted their rights during stops, as Judge Langston had done, agents frequently treated that assertion as obstruction rather than legitimate constitutional exercise, escalating encounters that should have been de-escalated. The evidence of retaliation against those who challenged unlawful stops was particularly stark. Individuals who questioned an agent's authority or cited their constitutional rights were significantly more likely to be arrested, detained longer, and charged with obstruction. The message was clear. Compliance was expected, rights were obstacles, and questioning authority came with consequences. While the investigation ground forward through depositions and data analysis, David Chen was negotiating a settlement in Judge Langston's case. The government's initial offer was $850,000, substantial by most standards, but insulting given the circumstances. Chen rejected it immediately. "Your client arrested a federal judge for loading groceries," Chen told the Department of Justice attorneys, handling the settlement discussions. "You have it on video from 4 different angles. You have body camera footage where your agent literally says he doesn't need reasonable suspicion. You have an Inspector General report documenting a 4-year pattern of racial profiling. And you think $850,000 resolves this?" The negotiations continued for 3 months. The government increased to $1.4 million. Chen countered at $6.5 million. They settled at $3.7 million, higher than typical federal civil rights settlements. For several reasons the government's own attorneys acknowledged in internal memos. The video evidence was crystal clear and indefensible. The victim's credibility as a federal judge who presided over these exact types of cases made any attack on his account impossible. The egregiousness of arresting someone specifically for asserting constitutional rights created facts that would make any jury furious. And the pattern evidence showed this wasn't an isolated mistake, but part of systemic problems the government had failed to address. The settlement was announced on a Tuesday morning in October, 13 months after Judge Langston had been handcuffed in a grocery store parking lot. The press conference was held at the federal courthouse, with David Chen and Judge Langston standing at a podium surrounded by representatives from immigrant rights organizations. "This settlement represents accountability," Chen told the assembled reporters. "But Judge Langston wants to make clear what he's doing with this recovery." Marcus stepped to the microphone, the same calm dignity that had carried him through the arrest evident in his bearing. "I'm donating the entire settlement," he said. $2 million will go to immigrant legal defense funds that provide representation to people who can't afford attorneys when they're facing deportation. $1.7 million will go to organizations fighting ICE overreach and advocating for constitutional limits on immigration enforcement. A reporter called out a question about why he wasn't keeping any of the money. Marcus looked directly into the camera. "I don't need the money. I have a federal salary and a comfortable life. But thousands of immigrants and citizens need protection from what happened to me. They need lawyers who can fight back when their rights are violated. They need organizations that can challenge unconstitutional enforcement policies. That's where this money can do the most good." The settlement made national news again, but this time the coverage focused less on the outrage of the arrest and more on what the case had exposed. Editorial boards wrote about the need for immigration enforcement reform. Legal scholars discussed the limits of administrative warrant authority. Immigrant advocacy organizations used the case as evidence in their calls for congressional oversight. And in Atlanta, the Civil Rights Division's investigation was moving toward a conclusion that would require far more than a settlement check. The consent decree was signed 4 months after the settlement, ending the Civil Rights Division's investigation not with exoneration, but with federal court supervision. ICE didn't admit wrongdoing in the formal legal language. Government agencies rarely do, but the mandated reforms told the real story. You don't enter a 5-year consent decree with comprehensive oversight requirements because everything was working fine. The reforms were sweeping and specific. Every public stop now required written documentation of reasonable suspicion articulated before the encounter, not rationalized afterward. Agents had to specify what immigration violation they suspected and what specific articulable facts supported that suspicion. Suspicious person calls without concrete details could no longer justify detention. Administrative warrants, the authority Torres had claimed, gave him unlimited power in public spaces, were explicitly limited to specific workplace enforcement operations with judicial authorization. They could not be used to justify random stops in parking lots, outside apartment buildings, or near schools. The consent decree clarified what immigration law had always required, but what field training had obscured. ICE agents were not general law enforcement with roving authority to demand papers from anyone who looked foreign. Body cameras became mandatory for all field operations, with footage automatically uploaded to a central server that supervisors and the Civil Rights Division could audit. No more, "the camera malfunctioned," or "I forgot to activate it." Excuses that had plagued accountability efforts for years. Every agent was required to complete 40 hours of constitutional limits training with annual refreshers. The training materials were developed in consultation with civil rights organizations and legal experts. Why not just internal ICE instructors who had been teaching the same inadequate curriculum that produced agents like Torres? Perhaps most significantly, the consent decree established an early warning system that tracked every agent's stop patterns. Supervisors received monthly reports showing each agent's stops by race and ethnicity, search rates, arrest rates, and outcomes. Agents whose stops showed statistical disparities or low rates of legitimate immigration violations triggered mandatory review and retraining. The kind of oversight that should have caught Torres years before he arrested a federal judge. A community oversight board was created with immigrant representation, given access to stop data and complaint records. They could raise concerns about problematic patterns and recommend policy changes. Federal monitors would review compliance quarterly for 5 years with the possibility of extension if problems persisted. The reforms were implemented across the Atlanta field office within 6 months. Other ICE field offices around the country watched closely, knowing the Civil Rights Division was examining whether similar consent decrees would be necessary elsewhere. Rafael Torres never worked in law enforcement again. He moved to Tennessee 3 months after his termination, took a job with a private security company providing guards for office buildings and retail stores. The job lasted 8 months before the company quietly let him go after employees complained about his aggressive interactions with shoppers he deemed suspicious. He left the security industry entirely after that, and working a series of jobs that kept him away from any position of authority. He gave one interview to a local Nashville television station 18 months after the arrest, sitting in shadow to preserve some anonymity he'd already lost. "I followed my training," he insisted to the interviewer. "Everything I did that day was consistent with how I was taught to conduct immigration enforcement." The interviewer, a young woman who had clearly done her homework, asked the obvious question. What specific suspicious behavior did Judge Langston exhibit that justified stopping him? Torres paused. His mouth opened, closed. He shifted in his chair. The call came in about a suspicious person. But what did you observe? What made him suspicious to you specifically? Torres couldn't answer. The interview ended shortly after. The station aired a brief clip, but decided the full segment would be more embarrassing than newsworthy. The clip that did air showed exactly what the investigations had proven. An agent who had no legitimate reason for the stop and couldn't articulate one even with 2 years of hindsight. The supermarket footage became required viewing at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, where new ICE agents receive their basic training. Every recruit now watches Judge Marcus Langston calmly cite Arizona versus United States while being handcuffed for loading groceries. The video is part of a module titled Constitutional Limits on Immigration Enforcement, followed by extensive discussion of what Torres did wrong and why those mistakes cost him his career and the government $3.7 million. Law schools across the country incorporated the case into constitutional law curricula. It became a perfect teaching tool. Clear facts, obvious violations, real consequences. Students watch the body camera footage and identify each constitutional violation in real time. Immigration advocacy organizations use it in community education workshops, teaching immigrants and citizens what their rights actually are when approached by ICE agents. Judge Langston returned to the bench 6 weeks after the settlement was announced. He had recused himself from all ICE-related cases during the litigation, but once the settlement was final and the consent decree signed, he resumed his full docket. Immigration cases. Civil rights cases. The same work he'd been doing for 20 years, but colleagues noticed a difference. And he had always been fair and attentive to constitutional violations. Now he was even more attuned to the power dynamics in his courtroom, more skeptical of government claims about the necessity of aggressive enforcement tactics. In private judicial conferences, away from the formal proceedings and public scrutiny, Judge Langston shared perspective that his colleagues found sobering. "What happened to me wasn't unique," he told them over coffee in the judge's chambers. "It was just documented. Thousands of citizens and immigrants experience this daily. They don't have federal credentials. They don't have legal knowledge to cite Supreme Court cases while being detained. They don't have resources to hire civil rights attorneys and fight back for months through federal litigation." The story highlighted a crucial truth that made even comfortable liberals uncomfortable. Even a powerful black federal judge with every possible advantage, education, credentials, institutional authority, financial resources, legal expertise, couldn't escape racial profiling. Immigration enforcement had become a tool of racial control, treating citizens of color as perpetually foreign in their own country, subject to demands for proof of belonging that white Americans never face. But the story also demonstrated something equally important. Accountability was possible when the system worked. Video evidence, judicial independence, civil rights organizations, media attention, and federal oversight had combined to produce real consequences. An agent was fired, a pattern was exposed, reforms were mandated, money was paid, policies were changed. The question was whether this represented a turning point or an exception, whether the accountability that worked for a federal judge would be extended to the thousands of others who experienced the same violations without cameras, without credentials, without power. What does real accountability look like? Does it require a federal judge to be victimized before the system responds? Or can it work for everyone? This story should make you angry. It should make you question how immigration enforcement operates in your community. It should make you think about who gets treated as suspicious and why. Was $3.7 million enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me if you think that number represents real accountability or just the cost of doing business for an agency with a massive budget. Share this story if you believe federal agents must respect constitutional rights, not just when they're dealing with judges, but when they're dealing with everyone. Every person deserves dignity. Every citizen deserves freedom from unlawful detention. Every immigrant deserves constitutional protection. And subscribe for more stories of justice and accountability, because these stories matter. They expose how power operates. They show when the system works and when it fails. They remind us that change is possible but never guaranteed.